Welcome to part 9 of the FOG Napoleonic introductory series. In this episode, we'll cover outcome moves and specifically retirements. Pursuit moves we'll cover in part 10. So you want to look at the table on page 104. Refer to this table once all combats have been resolved to work out whether you should retire, and if so, how far. You'll see from this table that infantry in square versus cavalry or in buildings will actually only retire if they're broken. Otherwise, they actually halt in position if they're only disordered or wavering. Otherwise, for normal retires, it's easy to remember. Infantry will retire either dice plus 0, dice plus 2, or plus 4, depending on whether they're disordered, wavering, or broken. And for cavalry, it's always 2 inches further than infantry. And also you can note from this table, artillery in the open who have to retire are broken. Okay, so let's look at the basic retire move rules which are covered on page 105 and 6. So units making a retire or being driven back move directly to their own rear, regardless of the facing of their opponent. Unless, of course, the enemy assaulted them or fired at them from the flank or rear, or arrived on table behind their flank or rear. In this situation, you can see here that one or A here has been fired from behind flank, so they first have to turn 90 degrees and then they retire off in this direction. If they'd been fired at from their rear, then they would have had to turn 180 degrees. A couple of points to note on this. So squares would treat their rear as the side furthest from the enemy. And troops in buildings will always retire directly away from the enemy, causing them to retire. So they pick the line as directly opposite from where the unit causing them to retire is coming from. And if they're fighting multiple units, they'll split the distance between the angle between them. Then what happens when you meet obstructions in the retirement move? So this is covered on page 107. So a few incidents to consider here. So meeting friendly units in a retire move. Here you can see the original path of the retire move of A, and it's going to contact B. And so the rule allows you that A meeting B, you can always shift by up to 1 base width to avoid B ending up in another position out of the way, and you shift by the minimum necessary. Then in this example, here you can see that there are 2 units now obstructing A, units B and C. So A meets both these units. It can shift up to 1 base width to avoid B, but can't shift enough to avoid C. And so if its move takes it at least halfway through C, who it's going to try and go through, then it bursts through and ends up on the opposite side. And as long as it doesn't move more than 50% of its move, it can go right through and end up on the far side. And C would need to take a cohesion test for having been burst through, but B doesn't have to test because A has shifted to avoid them. In this example, as you can see from the shadowed area, A's path of retire doesn't get it halfway through either of the units. And so what happens is it actually halts on this side 1 MU away from C, but C will take a test as if they'd been burst through. So a slightly different nuance. The key to remember is if you get into a unit, can you get halfway through? If you get halfway through, you can bounce all the way through to the other side. Then what happens when you meet enemy units or rear table edges in a retire move? So in this example, A's path of retire meets enemy unit B. You cannot shift to avoid enemy. So therefore A stops 1 MU short of B. That's pretty much the only thing you can't shift to avoid. You can shift to avoid friends, table edges, terrain, impassable stuff, that kind of thing, but not enemy. And in this example, A is already within 1 MU of B at the start of the move. And if that's the case, then A can't obviously shift to avoid them and is instead destroyed and counts as routed for cohesion losses. Tactically, you'll sometimes see players push their unit right up behind an enemy unit in contact or it's going to be shot at for this situation to occur. So you need to not let enemy get behind you, obviously. And then just some things for meeting rear table edges. So if you get to the rear table edge, you stop at the edge. However, if your unit was already within 1 MU of the rear edge at the start of your retire move, you are then destroyed. So side edges you can slide up to go past them, as you'd see on the table earlier. But rear table edges are, you don't want to get stuck against your rear table edge. Okay, and then buildings. So when you meet buildings in a retire move, if A gets at least halfway into the building, then A can occupy the building. If A doesn't get halfway into the building, then you treat the building as impassable terrain, and there are rules for how you shift to go around impassable terrain. So here you can see, so A has now reached the building, doesn't get halfway in, and needs to wheel by the minimum necessary to move parallel to the edge of the obstruction. And a similar thing would happen if it was impassable terrain or a side table edge. So that's it for retire moves. In the next episode, we will cover pursuit moves.